And thank you, Demand Progress, for hosting this event and allowing us to talk about something that's really, really important to the panelists and myself and to so many people, because as you said, it is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Roughly 6 months into the Biden administration, conditions on the ground remain very desperate. About 80% of Yemen's people are in need of humanitarian assistance. 5 million face death from hunger and malnutrition, and 400,000 children under the age of 5 are expected to die this year from severe acute malnutrition if urgent action is not taken. While the Biden administration announced some really positive policy changes, including an end to U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi-led coalition's war in Yemen, critical elements of that U.S. support remain, and some of the definitions of offensive and defensive. Does offensive operations include any military support for the blockade? Some of those things remain undefined and have not been publicly clarified. There's also been, no confirmation that the U.S. has meaningfully pressured Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade, despite the administration's stated opposition to the restrictions on all these ports of entry. We've seen numerous congressional letters signed by a bipartisan group of over 100 members of Congress. We've gotten very little attention to that, not the responses that we would have hoped for. And unfortunately, the ports of entry are still restricted to commodities. And in May, we saw no fuel enter Hodeidah, which is Yemen's largest port. So after 6 months of very little progress on the humanitarian crisis, there really is a growing frustration among members of Congress and advocates and civil society. And so this event, I think, is really critical. It comes at a very important moment and follows up on our past discussions on this topic and hopes to offer some updates on the blockade, the humanitarian crisis, tries to add some clarity to what the U.S.'s continued role in the war is, and maybe even offer some perspectives for what Congress can do about this situation. With that, I'd like to first introduce Shireen Alademi. She's an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University, and since 2015, she's played a very active role in raising awareness about the Saudi-led coalition's war on her country of birth, Yemen, and works to encourage political action to end U.S. support for the war. And I will say that she's also had a big influence on me, and it's taught me so much about this crisis and what people can do about it. Another friend and colleague, Elias, is the director of the Security Assistance Monitor at the CIP, or Center for International Policy, where he analyzes the impact of U.S. arms transfers and security assistance programs on international security, U.S. foreign policy, and global human rights practices. Yousif has substantial experience working on armed conflict research, international security, and civilian protection issues, both in D.C. and in the Middle East. And last but not least, Marcus Stanley is the advocacy director of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Prior to joining Quincy, he spent a decade at Americans for Financial Reform, where he helped direct the efforts of a coalition of 200 organizations on a range of legislative and regulatory initiatives to challenge the power of Wall Street. Before that, he was an economic and policy advisor to Senator Barbara Boxer as a senior economist at the U.S. Joint Economic Committee. While there, he produced War at Any Price, a seminal study on the full costs of the Iraq invasion used to build political support to end the U.S. role in the war. I just wanted to flag for people that Qatar was going to be joining us, but had a family emergency and is unable to attend. And but we look forward to this really robust discussion with these amazing panelists. And with that, I'd like to start off the discussion with a question for Shireen. Could you provide everybody here with some context about what's happening with regards to the humanitarian crisis, the blockade, and ongoing negotiations? And is there anything you can tell us about what life is like in Yemen right now on a day-to-day level, as members consider further legislative action on Yemen?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Hassan, and for Demand Progress for hosting us. As Kevon mentioned, this is a really urgent and dire situation and continues to be for um, roughly 80% of the Yemeni population, if not more. So what was bad then is worse now. And it's always difficult, I think, for people to understand just how terrible things are in Yemen, but they continue to get even worse. So I just want to remind people that in February, the United Nations agencies warned that 400,000 children under the age of 5 were going to die this year if conditions didn't improve. Here we are in July, and presumably 200,000 children have already died because their needs have not, their most basic human needs have not been met. This is roughly a child every 75 seconds. I don't think this is comprehensible. It used to be a child every 10 minutes, which of course is horrific to think about. And these are children under the age of 5. We're not even talking about the entire population. Um, Most recently, just yesterday, there were some floods that killed 14 people in the south of Yemen. And this, of course, adds further to the humanitarian condition and to destruction of infrastructure and whatnot. Um, like you said, Hassan, there's been no fuel entering Hodeidah in May, despite the pressure from Congress. The Biden administration has not applied any diplomatic pressure, as far as we know, to the Saudis regarding to lifting the blockade. And so what it means is that because there's not enough fuel entering the country, or really no fuel entering the country at times, and there's a bifurcation of the Yemeni currency, would just hit an all-time record low of $1 equaling 1,000 Yemeni riyals. For context, before the war, it was about 250 Yemeni riyals to a dollar. And so the currency was bifurcated between north and south when the central bank was moved from Sana'a to Aden some years back. The government stopped paying government workers their salaries. And now, with the crash of the currency, whatever is in the country, people are unable to afford that. So, even for humanitarian groups, for example, food baskets have risen in cost by 20% or so. Um, in terms of airstrikes, even though 2021 has seen low civilian casualties, I mean, there's not that daily bombing that we used to see in Sana'a and in other areas over the years, but areas like Ma'rib in the north and Hajjah also in the north are still seeing targeted and increased airstrikes. So comparing May to June, according to the Yemen Data Project, there's been an increase of 44% of airstrikes, with 34 of those targets that they identified. Of the 34 that they've identified, 16 targeted residential areas, 2 targeted farms, as well as private business, civilian car, and road. So the casualties continue to mount. And of course, airstrikes mean most likely US supported airstrikes by the Saudis and the UAE. The UAE continues to kind of go under the radar, even though they continue to support the secessionists in the south, which complicates the stated goals of restoring Hadi to power. And just yesterday, there was a report that pro-government Saudi commentators were now publicly criticizing the role of the UAE in undermining essentially the Saudi-led effort in Yemen. And they're all but occupying the island of Socotra. There are flights now from the UAE to Socotra. And so the blockade, like I mentioned, continues to be a major factor in Yemen. So the Saudis are still controlling the airspace. They haven't opened Sana'a airport yet. They are using UN Security Council Resolution 2216 to justify the blockade. Essentially, the UNSC 2216 authorizes Saudi to prevent the entry of ships into Yemen to avoid arms shipments to the Houthis. But they also prevent, they've kind of weaponized this and have weaponized fuel and food and all sorts of things from entering the country, which of course we know is crucially important for a country like Yemen that imports 90% of its food and fuel. So life on a daily basis is extremely difficult. People are having to continue to make decisions that no one should make, like, skipping meals, undergoing exploitation to be able to afford just basic necessities. There's, electricity is an issue, of course, so people can't, escape the heat, or, they can't find enough food to eat. They can't find enough fuel to burn, for the most basic needs. And we're not even talking about hospitals that have been forced to shut down and things like that. Clean water continues to be an issue. I spoke to a friend in northern province of Jowf, and he said there's just no way to get fresh water into the community. There's a shortage of water in that area as well. And so I think whatever we've been seeing over the last few years the impact has just been worse and have just been compounded because there's not been any movement. The blockade hasn't been lifted. The airstrikes have stopped and have reduced in certain areas and have increased in areas like Ma'rib. And there have been negotiations between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, which is great that there are direct negotiations with Oman as a trusted mediator, to be a trusted interlocutor between these two parties. But none of the terms have yet been met. And of course, the Houthis expect Saudi to, they expect all foreigners to leave Yemen, and they also expect Saudis to lift the blockade and to allow the reopening of Sana'a airport. While the Saudis, of course, are also expecting to reinstate Hadi, but that's seen as no longer seen as a term that can realistically be met. And so now I think their best hope is to just get some securities for their border protection from the Houthis, to get some guarantees that their border is going to be secure. But beyond that, I think they just have to acknowledge that they've lost this war despite the support of the international community and 6 years of leading this war against the Houthis. So I'll stop there, and I'm not sure if you have any follow-up or if I answered all of the parts of your question.
Shireen, I really appreciate that that description. You paint a really desperate situation on the ground. You paint a picture of ongoing U.S. complicity, and you also paint a picture of a situation that requires more action by Congress and the administration. And actually, that is a great segue into our next panelist, Elias. There's going to be a chance at the end of this conversation for people to weigh in with questions. I do encourage everybody to go to the Q&A function on this Zoom meeting and pop in any questions that you have for our panelists. I see a couple great questions in there already. So Elias, really happy that you're here with us. I have had the pleasure of working with you on a lot of these issues, and really enjoyed a great report that CIP had put out on this very issue. So many activists, myself included, were really thrilled about the Biden administration's announcement to end U.S. support for offensive operations, but really a lot of key questions remain. And 41 members of Congress, led by Reps DeFazio and Khanna, wrote a letter to the president early this year, and they had specific questions about what support has been ended, what's the definition of offensive and defensive. And while the State Department eventually did respond, many legislators weren't satisfied with the answers that were given, and a lot of these questions still remain. Furthermore, Tim Lenderking, Biden's special envoy to Yemen, came to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee a couple months ago to discuss issues around the blockade, but was really unable to, give much detail about ongoing military support and exactly what ways the U.S. has been applying leverage to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade. And I'm wondering if you could, take us into, some of these answers about, what the CIP report said about ongoing U.S. involvement for the war via maintenance, any intel, logistical support, and just really talk us through that whole, what you all found in your study, and maybe offer some insight on, what support for offensive operations looks like, and, kind of take us through some more of these details that are critical for us to understand what's going on here.
Yeah, Hassan, thanks very much for that and for the question. It's really great to be here, and thanks to our host for convening this discussion. I don't think there can be enough panels on this topic, so I appreciate it. As Hassan said, I'm the Deputy Director of the Security Assistance Monitor, where I manage a publicly available database tracking U.S. arms sales, security assistance, foreign military training. So As you might expect, the decades-long security partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia has long been a key area of interest for us, but acutely so since 2015 at the start of Riyadh's intervention in Yemen. I, I think it's clear from both what Hassan said and what Shireen said that it explains why President Biden's February announcement of a cessation of U.S. support for offensive operations in Yemen was greeted with such fanfare. I think for many, including myself, it offered a bit of hope that the U.S. was finally placing its diplomatic muscle behind efforts to end the conflict rather than enabling it. But I think, as we are all aware, and people on this call especially, executive ambiguity and reticence on the matter has raised serious questions about the practical nature of enduring U.S. support to the Saudi war effort. As Shireen said, with Yemenis still suffering from acute supply shortages brought about by the Saudi blockade and from enduring Saudi airstrikes, sussing out the specifics of what U.S. support looks like and how that can be leveraged to improve the humanitarian situation on the ground, it's all the more important. So specifically, what do we know of U.S. support? What's changed and what remains the same? At a basic level, there have been important changes to U.S. engagement with the Saudi war effort. Days after the president's announcement, Cencom said it was suspending targeting assistance, as well as the provision of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance inside Yemen that Riyadh could reasonably use to identify, select, and strike at targets. The U.S. has continued to refrain from air-to-air refueling of Saudi aircraft, and vitally, the U.S. has suspended a number of arms transfers to the kingdom, including for precision-guided munitions that were proposed for export at the very tail end of the Trump administration. So while those changes are all notable, much of the expansive security cooperation relationship between Washington and Riyadh remains the same, and the U.S. continues to provide vital services to the Saudi armed forces. So, firstly, Cencom continues to monitor Yemeni territory and provide defensive intelligence and warning to the Saudis, particularly for incoming projectiles directed at the kingdom. I think that given the historically close intelligence relationship between the two countries, more clarity from the administration on broader intel sharing in relation to the conflict would be really useful. Additionally, questions remain on a variety of other arms transfers to Saudi Arabia that seem likely to continue, particularly if they are not designed to interface with fixed-wing aircraft. For example, without further clarity from the White House, I think it's likely that munitions for rotary wing aircraft, artillery pieces and their ammunition, armored vehicles, and even training could still be making their way to Saudi Arabia. But as Hassan alluded to, I think perhaps most concerningly is the ongoing U.S. maintenance and sustainment support for the Royal Saudi Air Force. For all the money the Saudis have spent on their armed forces, they remain overwhelmingly dependent on foreign assistance to maintain their air fleet. And this is especially true for some of that higher end maintenance and sustainment. And accordingly, the Saudis have spent tens of billions for these services, which, as far as we know, continue to be administered. These maintenance packages have been purchased both through foreign military sales, which are government to government, and as well as through commercial contracts licensed by the State Department. So these contracts are commonly multi-year in nature and can often require the detailing of U.S. government personnel alongside commercial contractors to fulfill. If you look at the report that we put out, we list a few as just examples of ones that we are concerned about. And as an example, a proposed sale from 2019 for, I think it was almost $2 billion in aircraft follow-on support and services required the assignment of a contingent of U.S. government personnel in addition to the private contractors. And I'll note that sale in particular was part of a larger package that was actually exempted from congressional review by the Trump administration's use of an invocation of an emergency authority, as many of you may recall from 2019. So in short, U.S. maintenance support to the Saudi warplanes remains indispensable for Riyadh's ability to field its aircraft. Without U.S. support for the bulk of its air fleet, which is predominantly American-made, Saudi Arabia simply could not keep its planes in the sky. So where I see a particular lack of clarity in addition to that is on how the administration interprets the Saudi blockade in the context of its moratorium on a support for offensive operations in Yemen. Saudi warplanes remain an integral component of the maritime and air blockade infrastructure that is preventing the transfer of essential goods to Yemen, especially fuel. And it's also worth noting that the US has sold advanced littoral combat ships to the Saudis, though I'm not certain what role, if any, they are playing in the maritime blockade. Ultimately, I think what this points to is a wider picture, and what I'm sure this audience is concerned with, which is the degree to which the United States is functionally integral to the Saudi military architecture. America has been the principal engine behind Saudi military developments for more than 80 years now, providing billions in defense equipment, services, and training that have come to define the Saudi defense sector. I'll also add we've been integral in the development of Riyadh's growing, albeit nascent, indigenous defense industry. And so in this context, the distinction between offensive and defensive support becomes increasingly blurry, particularly when you're talking about an integrated combined arms military like that of the Saudis. So as a starting point, I think this illustrates the need for significantly greater transparency on the part of the administration when it comes to its policy regarding the war in Yemen and its ongoing support to Saudi Arabia in any capacity, particularly given the explicit inquiries from lawmakers in recent months. And at the very least, it would also suggest that the US maintains significant leverage for pressing the royal court to pursue not only good faith peace negotiations, which others have mentioned, but also changes in military policy to include an essential relaxation of the Yemeni blockade. The US has an interest in ending the war in Yemen and stemming its humanitarian toll. And yes, there is some evidence that suggests that pressure exerted thus far is bearing some diplomatic fruit. I hope reports of a reduction in Saudi airstrikes and steps towards a negotiated settlement are true, but I think everyone on this call would agree that we don't have the luxury of time. And any pressure that can be brought to bear now is worth considering, including any influence the US has so far kept in reserve. In the short term, I think this specifically means a relaxation of the blockade, and that should be a prime area of concern for the Biden administration. I'm going to close with this, and I mentioned it because I know it's been an argument that's discussed a lot lately. I know some have been concerned that an exertion of too much pressure vis-a-vis the US military partnership with Riyadh will eventually lead the kingdom to turn elsewhere for its security needs, Russia, China, whoever. I'll just say very briefly that I think these concerns, real though they may be, fail to take into account the degree of dependence that the Saudis still have on the US for their military enterprise. And while such a transition is not impossible, it would represent a generational shift in structures, material, doctrines, security architecture that would cost billions at a time when Saudi budgets are already quite strained and take many years to accomplish. So just wanted to note that before I turn back over to you, Hassan.
Wow, thank you so much. That's a really comprehensive overview. Elias, before you jump, there was one thing I wanted to ask while it's fresh in my mind. Now, you talked about this maintenance support and how critical that is to the sustainment of the Saudi warplanes. I was wondering if you could dig into that just a little bit more. We've heard folks like Bruce Riedel talk about it, but in your own words, knowing that there's ongoing maintenance support for Saudi warplanes, is it possible for them to do their own maintenance? Can you kind of dig into that just a little bit?
Yeah, so there has been quite a bit of discussion about the ability for the Saudis to go it on their own, and they've made substantial investments over especially the last decade, to sort of create improved defense independence. But at this stage, the Saudis remain inextricably dependent on foreign partners to sustain their air fleet. And what I mean by that is quite simply that the Saudis would not be able to field their aircraft or keep them in the skies for really any period of time, were it not for ongoing US support specifically. The Saudis do maintain European fighter jets as well, the Eurofighter among others, but for the most part, the bulk of their fleet remains American F-15s. And they have spent considerably in the tens of billions of dollars to keep American contractors, and in some cases, it appears, American government personnel keeping those planes in the sky. And so I don't think it can be overstated. And in that sense, there is a real question about this distinction between offensive and defensive support. I think if you are providing the means for those planes to fly over Saudi skies, and as I mentioned, to provide a component of the maritime blockade, I think this is important to note that a blockade isn't just boats in the water, it's a wider infrastructure that includes aircraft. I think there's a real question as to whether or not that should be considered offensive operations. I mean, the distinction is sort of immaterial in many ways.
That it's really insightful, and I encourage our entire audience to, after this panel is over, to dig into Elias's, amazing report from the Security Assistance Monitor, and with that, let's talk about what we can actually do about this. And we have Marcus Stanley from the Quincy Institute, who's with us here. If you want to jump on camera. Marcus, you've been doing a ton of advocacy, going to, meeting after meeting with members, talking about these vehicles that we have, that Congress has to take action on this. And I guess, could you go through what's been done on the blockade in Congress so far? Both in terms of statements and maybe even legislation, and what still has to be done. I mean, there are a lot of staffers joining us today, and I think they want to know what they should be asking their bosses to do on this. And the picture that Shireen and Elias have painted, kind of points to ongoing U.S. complicity despite the Biden executive order. So I think we'd love some clarity here.
Yeah, so I'll definitely finish with the what do we do question, which I think is really the critical thing for people to take away from today's presentation. But I want to go back a little bit into the legislative history of Congress's attempts to address this war, because it's been considerable. And as I'm sure most of the people on this call know, it started under the Trump administration, where Congress actually did pass a war powers resolution to bring an end to U.S. support for Saudi aggression in Yemen, and that war powers resolution, it was sort of legalistically questioned at the time because it focused on mid-air refueling and targeting, and there were claims made that these were not acts of war. But of course, under war powers, Congress gets to define what is an act of war under the very general language in the 1973 War Powers Resolution, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And Congress did pass that War Powers Resolution, and it was vetoed by the Trump administration, a veto of arguable constitutionality, I personally believe. But even though that veto was not challenged, that War Powers Resolution, the passage of that War Powers Resolution, still led to the end of mid-air refueling, and it also brought tremendous attention to this issue, and I think helped drive the Biden administration's commitment to ending hostilities in the war. And we also saw during the Trump administration that there were several provisions passed in the NDAA, in the defense authorization legislation, that would have cut off all support, including logistical support for the Saudi military until there was an end to those hostilities in Yemen. But those were stripped out in conference. They were passed by the Democratic House, but stripped out in conference. So when you look at this very vital and forceful legislative action under the Trump administration, you would really have hoped that 6 months into the Biden administration, where we have Democratic control of both houses of Congress, and there was bipartisan support for these measures in the Trump administration, but I think it's fair to say that in the House in particular, these efforts were associated somewhat with the Democratic Party. Um, given the Biden administration's pledge and all three branches of government under one party, you would have hoped that things would really have changed on the ground in Yemen. And as we've heard this whole time, they really haven't. And what we have seen in the first 6 months is some real attempts by Congress to sort of question and pressure the Biden administration, and at least to ask, what's happening? What does your pledge really mean? Why hasn't it been executed on? And we saw, I think you actually mentioned some of these, Hassan, in your introduction, with the questions to Lender King, which he was really unable to answer in his confirmation, and also very important, the letter led by Representative DeFazio and others with many signers that really put tough questions to the administration about what's going on here and what kind of continued support is going on, and why haven't these offensive operations come to an end. And as I think a couple people have noted, the administration response was really unsatisfactory. I'm going to drop in the chat an Intercept article about that that goes into some detail, and I think all of us panelists have the text of the letter, but it was a very evasive, legalistic response, which said that, as Elias noted, there were a few weapon systems that were cut off, that were not sold, and the U.S. had increased its. So there was suspension of some sales of munition. There was increased humanitarian aid, but a lot of the letter talked about continued logistical support to Saudi forces for defensive purposes, and really tried to justify that, and really didn't answer the question of how are we stopping aggressive action here, as opposed to just engaging in diplomacy while this stalemated and bloody war grinds on. So what you really saw in that letter, I think, is a reluctance that the administration is reluctant to really use our full leverage with Saudi Arabia. And that is really the key dynamic driving a lot of what we're seeing both on the ground and in Congress. And one thing that I talk about with people is, when I'm in these meetings, is Congress has raised this question. Congress has posed these questions to the administration multiple times. There was also a letter from Senator Warren, and gotten unsatisfactory answers. So now is the time for action. But what's pushing against that action, I think, is that administration reluctance to really kind of prioritize ending this war over having a nice relationship with Saudi Arabia. And we're seeing, I think, in part coming from the administration, a lot of legalisms about defensive versus offensive operations, which Elias did a really good job of talking about why those really can't be separated. A lot of legalisms about what can and can't be done under a war powers resolution. I'll talk about that in a minute. But frankly, I think Congress has constitutional and statutory authority to do what it wants under a war powers resolution, and a lot of these things are distractions. And we're also seeing more rhetoric being floated, faulting the Houthis for their own flaws and their own human rights violations, which may well be true, but I think it's very important to separate ending this war and its impact on civilians from the back and forth about the faults of both sides. When you have a really bloody, grinding, stalemated war engaging, you've got to prioritize that is killing innocents. You've got to prioritize ending that war, and you can have a process for discussing the diplomacy between the two sides afterwards. So in terms of current things that can be done, I think there's sort of two broad channels. One is to use must-pass legislation, such as appropriations legislation and things like the National Defense Authorization Act, to put in provisions that cut off funding or cut off authorization for the war. And I would note that there is a provision in the current defense appropriations-based text released by Representative McCollum that would cut off support for Yemen operations, although I think it lacks some of the specificity regarding the logistical support to the Saudi Air Force that we've seen in some previous provisions. But I think it's a very positive provision that should lead people to support this defense appropriations bill. We haven't really seen the NDAA yet, but we can hope for something there. And we can hope for perhaps, there's nothing in the state and foreign operations provisions now, but we can hope for something in SFOPs, perhaps an amendment. But I think one thing that is true about this channel of using individual provisions in these big must-pass bills is, first of all, they can be cut out in a back room. I mean, that's what we saw. There were multiple such provisions passed by the House under the Trump administration, and they were removed in Congress. And the second is they really don't shine a light on the issue in the same way. They're very sort of inside baseball technique, which is fine. You know, we're all like within DC, I guess we're all sort of inside baseball people a little bit, but they don't bring the public pressure and the public spotlight on the administration in terms of saying, hey, you know, this is a humanitarian catastrophe, children are dying, you promised to end it, it hasn't ended. You know, instead they sort of submerge the issue in big pieces of legislation that raise lots and lots of issues, you know, around the world. So the other avenue is a war powers resolution. And a war powers resolution, I think, really has the strength that it does shine that spotlight and it does force the question. And it's something that can be brought to the floor by a single member in a privileged status. So it's something that, you know, you're not dependent on sort of leadership backing you up on. Now, there are some issues in terms of the war powers clock being suspended because of COVID, but I don't think that can really continue indefinitely, and it particularly can't continue if it's seen as an excuse for not dealing with Yemen. You know, if there is a push to do a war powers resolution and leadership tries to quash it that way, I don't really think that is feasible. And I think we're also seeing, I think in part because the administration's reluctance to really put pressure on Saudi Arabia here, or the apparent reluctance, we are seeing these sort of legalisms popping up about the war powers resolution, sort of claiming that that U.S. activity in Saudi Arabia does not rise to the level of an introduction of U.S. forces into that war, and that you know, there's some legal issue with having there be a war powers resolution. You know, the actual text of the 1973 War Powers Act is very broad, and Congress gets to define those terms. And just to quote from that text of the 1973 War Powers legislation, the term introduction of United States Armed Forces includes the assignment of members of such armed forces to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of, or accompany regular or irregular military forces of any foreign country or government where such military forces are engaged in hostilities. So, you know, is it the case we, as Elias said, you know, there are U.S. military personnel involved in the sustainment and provisioning of Saudi planes that are doing strikes in Yemen. Does that involvement involve coordinating or participating in the movement of? You know, to me, I think there's a very obvious argument that if you're refueling a plane and repairing a plane so that it can take off and bomb somebody, that's participating in the plane's movement. And we also saw, by the way, we saw exactly these kind of arguments about midair refueling and these kind of legalisms raised in the 2018 War Powers Resolution. But once the War Powers Resolution moved forward and got real support, they quickly cut off the midair refueling because they sort of had to examine their activity and the areas that made them most vulnerable to that War Powers Resolution. So Congress can write a resolution as broadly as it likes. It can define these terms that are there on the introduction of U.S. armed forces, and it would seem to me that those terms really would encompass what we're seeing, what Elias described in terms of U.S. involvement in Saudi Arabia. So I do think a War Powers Resolution has, even though these other avenues are very important in terms of pieces of must-pass legislation, I think a War Powers Resolution has a lot of advantages in really forcing the question and shining a light on this issue.
Marcus, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And I see there's been a bunch of questions in the chat. I got one that I think Elias is best suited to answer this first one. So I want you to break down for us, if you can, how many U.S. aircraft maintainers and people, doing this, maintenance and logistical support are uniformed personnel versus contractors. I think it's kind of, I think any clarity around that would be super helpful if you can provide that.
Yeah, I'll try my best here because I think, and this is a point that my program makes persistently about almost all aspects of U.S. security cooperation, is that there just really is a lack of transparency to make strong statements on the issue. But I think that we know enough to be a little speculative here. For example, we've seen a number of notifications for arms sales to Congress that indicate there are going to be hundreds of contractors and a handful of U.S. personnel. For example, there was a foreign military sale, I believe in 2018, that made explicit mention of, it was a sale for maintenance of rotary aircraft that made mention of 320 contractors and 1 government personnel. There was another for the one that I mentioned a contingent of U.S. government personnel and likely dozens more contractors. But I think it's also important to remember that those contractors are there either through a government-to-government sale, which is negotiated directly with any given administration, or through direct commercial sales that are licensed by the State Department. So, obviously there may be some legalese with regards to the complicity when comparing a contractor to a uniformed personnel, but ultimately there are Americans there in a variety of capacities aiding the Saudi war effort. And I'll also add that beyond that, the U.S. maintains a robust military presence in the kingdom, whether that's through defense attaches, the U.S. military training program there. And so, I don't want to mislead people in thinking that there are just 1 or 2 people doing this. I think that it's important to remember this is a whole of government approach that has gone on for decades to support the Saudi military. And yes, that includes uniformed individuals who could be aiding in the maintenance of aircraft, but it's much bigger than that.
Thank you so much. And if I may, I'd like to add that Rep. Ro Khanna was able to pass an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act in FY 2021 that would do a report on U.S. military support and defense articles, going to support the blockade and restrictions on ports of entry. Now, we're probably going to get that report from the Government Accountability Office in the early part of next year. I'm assuming December or January, possibly January 2022. So, things are in the works, but it's not fast enough, and we need answers way sooner. I see there are several great questions in the chat here. Again, I encourage our audience to, put questions to our esteemed panelists in there, and and definitely engage these smart people. There was one here that I think is really important. This is from Bert. How does the proposed National Security Powers Act, recently introduced by Senators Murphy, Sanders, and Lee — I'll just note that they're the people that introduced the Yemen War Powers Resolution originally, that passed in the Senate — how does that affect the current congressional strategy for a new Yemen war powers? Does that do we need to pass that before we can do a war powers? Maybe Marcus can kind of take us through maybe even what's in the National Security Powers Act and where does that leave us on the Yemen question?
Well, let me turn on my video here. Okay, I think you need to turn on my video, Hassan. I think it's really a mistake to think that the National Security Powers Act just introduced 2 days ago has some really great things in it. It sort of strikes at some of the abuses of executive war powers we've seen over the past couple decades, like stretching AUMF's authorization of military force to last forever and justify all kinds of things that weren't in the original AUMF, declaring national emergencies to facilitate all kinds of aggressive activities, including sanctions against other countries, arms sales that are then used in hostilities, even if U.S. forces are not involved. Our weapons are. The NSPA really sort of sets up a streamlined procedure to force congressional involvement in all those activities, and it tidies up some elements of the War Powers Act. It sunsets authorizations of military force. It ties funding directly to congressional approval in cases of hostilities. So there's really good things in there, but I think it would be a big mistake to think that the introduction of this new legislation means that the current congressional war powers are somehow not usable. The current congressional war powers are very usable. As I said in my first remarks, there's a very broad definition of introduction of U.S. forces that can be used in the 1973 war powers legislation. It's really just a matter of Congress's willpower to use that legislation and to to craft war powers resolutions that bind the administration, and frankly to go to court if the administration denies that it violates those war powers resolutions. Congress has those powers. They're in the Constitution. They're in the 1973 statute. We don't need to pass anything new in order to exercise those powers. And so the NSPA, while it's great, and it addresses things like arms sales and sanctions and national emergency declarations that aren't addressed in war powers, we still have our war powers to use, whether or not that passes.
Thank you so much. Super helpful. There's another question here I wanted to flag. This is another one by Bert. How do we build a more coordinated, sustained, and powerful movement at the grassroots level to make the Yemen crisis a social issue that moves public opinion in the U.S. and builds grassroots pressure on the government to stop all support for the war? How do we build more momentum? If I could, I wanted to briefly touch on that. Is that when I first started working on this, I didn't know much. Shireen, it was actually my first introduction to the crisis in Yemen. And at that point, we really hadn't forced votes. We didn't do that first Yemen War Powers vote. And that was kind of my introduction, is working on that War Powers resolution on what people called the Forgotten War. And I'm wondering if folks could maybe speak to that, how we build some more momentum here, because we had a lot under Trump, and now we have the Biden in power. We have Democrats controlling the House, Democrats controlling the Senate, and this issue feels a bit stuck. So what can we do to move this conversation forward? I open it up to any of the panelists if they want to chime in.
chime in here. Thank you for that question. You know, this is the interesting thing here. This is the moment to really not get bogged down with all of the politics that we know can happen and the technicalities. And I heard Marcus say, like, you know, Congress should really seize the opportunity now. And I just want to remind people that back in 2015 and 2016, when this war started under the Obama administration, there's very little motivation by Democrats to do much about this topic. And now it's starting to feel like they're accepting certain responses from the administration that they wouldn't have accepted under Trump. And so I think the bottom line here is that we are involved in, you know, what many have called a genocide, an ongoing genocide. That's what happens, you know, when you're blocking fuel and food to people who desperately need it. It's not a fair fight. You know, you can talk about the Houthis and their crimes against civilians, but, you know, they don't even have a single aircraft, let alone an international community that's behind the Saudi-led coalition. And so we, the United States, is complicit in every aspect of this war, have been complicit in the genocide of the Yemeni population since 2015. And the urgency seems to be lost sometimes in Congress and among others. I think we'll be judged very critically and harshly by history, but really we're being judged now. You know, people are dying now. In this last hour, how many children have already perished? How many kids have already died? And for us Yemeni Americans, it's been very frustrating because nothing has changed on the ground except that things have gotten worse. And yet the administration seems to be playing these semantics and explaining that, you know, well, it's not defense, it's not offensive, it's defensive now. But at the end of the day, we're still supporting the Saudi-led coalition. They're still our allies. If a non-ally was involved in a war as egregious as this, we would be sanctioning them. We would maybe even wage war against them, let alone support them with weapons and intelligence and all of that over the years. And so I think we really just need to be bringing up these issues as citizens, as tax-paying people here in this country, saying this shouldn't be happening in our name. Congress won't feel the need to do anything unless they're hearing from their constituents in town halls, you know, in letters and emails, to continue that pressure up and to let them know that we are watching their reaction. We saw that momentum build under the Trump administration, and it does not need to be fizzled out now that there's a Democratic president. This is the third administration now waging war in Yemen, and we should be very aware of our responsibility toward our fellow human beings in Yemen.
I'll just add to that very briefly, and Shireen said it better than I could, so I won't dig as much into that, but I will say that on this issue of whataboutism with regards to Houthi IHL violations, I think when it comes to the American context, we just don't have the leverage over the Houthis that we have with the Saudis. And if I were talking to the Omanis or the Iranians, I would be encouraging them to do everything they can to limit any sort of civilian harm on the part of their ally or partner. But the reality is the U.S. has access to really only a handful of parties to this conflict, and anything that they're not doing to improve IHL performance, or I should say, mitigating civilian harm, that is on us. And so I'm just to answer that question about, you know, what about the Houthis? I sort of think it's irrelevant in our context.
Elias, thank you so much. And Shireen, thank you so much. Just really critical questions here. Yeah, I mean, I think as I have conversations about this issue, a lot of people say, well, what's going on, you know, with the Houthis? Are we holding them accountable? And I always ask, what leverage after 6 years of war, blockade, airstrikes, targeting, you know, in large part civilians and civilian infrastructure, you know, what do we have left? I see Marcus wanted to maybe jump in and kind of cover some of this as well. I invite him to join.
Thanks, Hassan. So yeah, I just wanted to say this issue of you know, what about the other side, and they're not perfect and they're also doing bad things. You know, this is kind of like what we see in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and frankly also what we saw with the North Vietnamese in Vietnam. You have a long, grinding, stalemated war that we clearly cannot bring to an end, that is killing civilians and killing innocent civilians. And we have the power to end that war, and in this case by influencing the Saudis. And it might be the case that that end to the war is not the perfect ending that we would have wanted. You know, the North Vietnamese committed human rights violations, the Taliban clearly. But step one to changing somebody's behavior is to end the war and to end conflict, because people you know, war leads to the killing of civilians, war leads to human rights violations, war leads both sides to be even darker and more brutal than they otherwise would be. And instead of making excuses not to end the war by just sort of finger pointing and saying the other side is bad too, you know, you have a moral obligation to end that war. And it's clear the Saudis aren't going to end that war through victory and bringing peace that way, just like we weren't going to bring peace to Vietnam by somehow getting the North Vietnamese to surrender. So let's move forward and end this war and discuss these things after. And a second question I just wanted to talk about, because it's so outrageous. Sorry for jumping in on this one, but this is Daniel Martin's question about how we were involved in Yemen to fight Al-Qaeda. This is just shows the craziness of US policy in the Middle East, because yes, we were doing strikes in Yemen to fight Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but guess who else is an enemy of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? The Houthis. And actually, we saw charges from Al Jazeera in 2018. There was an article saying that the Saudis were actually teaming up with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in order to fight the Houthis. And this is, we've seen similar kinds of things in Syria, where we went in to fight ISIS, supposedly, and that was our justification, but we ended up financing people, we ended up fighting people who were ISIS's enemies. And this is really, it's something I didn't mention before, but Quincy has done a lot of work on this, that because of how close our relationship is to Saudi Arabia, we get entangled in a lot of things in the Middle East that are absolutely not in our national interests. You know, because we are so entangled with Saudi Arabia, we are in this war in Yemen, which is not related to our national interest. We are fighting the Houthis, who are enemies of our enemies, enemies of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And we may even be supporting the Saudis at the same time as they're supporting Al-Qaeda. So until we get like more distance on the Saudis, and until we start saying that pursuing our human rights and values interests, and frankly our national interests in combating things like Al-Qaeda have a higher priority than our relationship with Saudi Arabia, we're going to get dragged into these crazy situations. So
really helpful, Marcus, and I appreciate your comments. Now, I wanted to ask a question specifically about the blockade for anybody that wants to answer. You know, sometimes you hear that the blockade is needed to prevent weapons from getting in to reach the Houthis. And I was wondering, is that true? Is that, you know, can someone maybe answer that question directly about the blockade? And, you know, is that really the function of what the Saudis are doing to UN approved ships?
I think this is a critical question. Sorry, Elias, maybe you can also add to what I'm going to
Go
say.
ahead, I'd rather you answer.
Okay. So in 2015, just a month into the war, the Saudis essentially wrote this resolution 2216, and it was approved, and they allowed or authorized themselves to impose this, you know, the checking of any maritime operations in that area to supposedly check for, you know, prevent for Iranian shipments or any other weapon shipments to the Houthis. Now, the UN also established an inspection and verification mechanism to make sure that there are no weapons coming into Hodeidah port, which the Houthis control. And in, you know, Tim Lenderking essentially said that this is working quite well. And so, here he is acknowledging in 2021 that that verification mechanism is working quite well. And yet fuel continues to be blockaded, food continues to be blockaded as they see fit. Sometimes it's a total blockade like we saw in November 2017, and sometimes it's partial. But essentially the Saudis get to decide what comes into the country and what doesn't. And they've grounded all airplanes coming in from the northern part of the country. So there are only 2 airports that are open, and they're both in the south. People who want to travel to northern parts of Yemen, it's a very difficult, treacherous journey. And of course, moving vehicles are target for airstrikes as well. So that's another complication. So no, it's been used as a justification, but it hasn't really worked to prevent. It's not really used essentially. Like the Houthis are not sending these sophisticated weapons to Saudi Arabia. They're sending some missiles, potentially with some parts from Iran, but it's nothing compared to what we see the Saudis dropping on Yemen with the support of the United States. But I'll let anyone else add to this.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's sort of, in my view, I don't have any special insights as to the intentionality. We can make some assumptions, but I think ultimately this conflict is dragged on for long enough to suggest that the blockade itself is not efficacious in preventing the Houthis from continuing their own operations. But what it is effective in is driving what the UN has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And so, whatever the intention may be, we know what the results are. And I think that is enough incentive to see a change in policy.
Super helpful, you both. Yeah, I appreciate that. And, the United Nations did establish a verification and inspection mechanism that ensures that, any of these ships landing in Djibouti with, commodities don't have weapons on them in accordance to 2216. And then after they get the UN stamp of approval, these ships are not being allowed into the country, despite over 100 members of Congress speaking out about this, despite what Shireen said is Lenderking saying that this this mechanism works quite well. So it's absolutely unconscionable that this would happen. I also wanted to flag, if I may, that World Food Program Director David Beasley, said that this is helping to create the world's worst humanitarian crisis and pushing us to the worst famine in modern history, and it needs to be lifted as a humanitarian act. And I'll add that this bipartisan group of over 100 members of Congress have really called on this blockade to be decoupled from ongoing negotiations, because otherwise that's a war crime. If you're doing collective punishment to a whole population because you want to gain leverage in political negotiations, that's just not okay. So I wanted to ask a really critical question that Kevin put in the chat here, in the question box. Is it possible that geopolitical factors are motivating continued support for the war to prevent Russia and China from gaining greater influence in the Middle East, similar to the situation in Syria? I think that was addressed a little bit earlier, but I'm wondering if Elias, Shireen, or Marcus can say more about that, and in general, more about the political situation. I know that the Biden administration's in talks about the JCPOA right now with Iran. There's a new president in Iran, Raisi, who has yet to take power. But what's going on outside of Yemen that's causing this situation to perpetuate? Elias.
Yeah, I'll take a stab first, and then I'll let my more esteemed panelists correct me where I'm wrong. So I think there are a number of reasons that have gone into, as Shireen mentioned, the multi-administration support for Saudi operations in Yemen. They are historical in terms of the depth of the relationship that's existed since the 1940s. But also they are geopolitical. Of course, there's always been this question as to, are we allowing so-called competitors to inch into the Middle East by not being the first partner of choice in any possible thing? I think in this instance, I think the liability that Yemen has proved to be for both the Emiratis and the Saudis suggests that we are not helping anybody in providing long-standing support for these operations. I'll also say that the issue of the Iran deal and Iran generally has also been discussed a lot. I think, speaking in terms of U.S. national interest, the conflict in Yemen has proved to be one of the least effective means of so-called countering Iran. And you can argue whatever you like about how smart that effort isn't generally, but for a small investment, we have pushed the Houthis closer to the Iranians. We have created a thorn in the Saudi side, or at least aided in the enduring insecurity on Saudi's southern border, so-called. And so really, even if you're arguing from the other side about, countering Iran and the importance of doing that, this isn't the theater that we've seen any sort of improvement in that matter. I think whether or not the argument's worthwhile is another question entirely, and I would stand on the other side of it. But I think that geopolitically speaking, the wisdom of any of this is questionable. And I have a hard time hearing any argument that suggests that U.S. support to the operation in Yemen have precluded Chinese or Russian engagement with the Emiratis or the Saudis. I don't think it's a very effective means of so-called countering Iran. If anything, it's provided Iran a useful platform for further presence in the Arab Gulf. And I also think that the humanitarian situation, and much to what Marcus mentioned, is the expansion of ungoverned spaces, has proved to be a boon for sub-state armed groups, whether that's groups that oppose the Hadi government in the south, secessionists, Al-Qaeda, other armed groups. And so no matter which angle you take in terms of what are the geopolitical interests of the United States, I'm having a hard time squaring that when it comes to Yemen. But Marcus, please.
Yeah, I'm going to drop in. I dropped in one Quincy report already in the chat on our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I'm going to drop in another recent Quincy report on our interests in the Middle East. And I think it's really important to kind of take a step back and say, what are the real U.S. security interests in the Middle East? Do we want to, just in a cold-blooded kind of way, do we want to prevent a regional hegemon from emerging who could control the world's oil supply? And probably and certainly we want to keep the oil flowing. I mean, I know there's all kinds of issues about fossil fuels, but just to be realistic here, we want to make sure that nobody is going to cut off the global supply of oil. And what this report documents is that right now there's a conflict in the Middle East between Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, also to a lesser degree, Syria or Iraq are sort of aligned here. None of these powers have the ability to cut off the flow of oil, or would be interested in doing, except in the most desperate circumstances. And there's also in this report an explicit discussion of this question of whether the Russians or Chinese would get involved. And the header on that part is the Russians and Chinese are not so foolish as to repeat our mistakes. We have gotten ourselves entangled militarily in the Middle East, and we've aligned ourselves with particular sides in these conflicts in the Middle East who have dragged us into wars and conflicts that created a tremendous cost and impact on the United States, on our international credibility, on our lives lost, on money spent. And why would another country want to go into that morass? I mean, Russia has for a long period, been supportive of Syria, so they didn't want to see Assad overthrown. But the idea that Russia is going to want to sort of generally fight some kind of giant regional war in the Middle East, is just not there. There's no reason or capacity for them to do that. And China, even less so. They've been focused on formulating economic ties to all the different sides in the Middle East. So there's really, when you take it away from sort of paranoia and you ask about other countries' real interests. These other countries have no reason to try to align themselves with Saudi Arabia in some giant battle to control the Middle East. And the example of the United States is one of the best examples for why that's actually not a good idea to do to yourself. And I just posted that report I mentioned.
Elias, did you want to give a last word? I
I
think
promise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please.
I'll make this so fast. I think the last thing I'll say is that there is increasing realization, I believe, in the Arab Gulf that this conflict has proved to be inextricably opposed to the interests of many of the participants of this conflict, whether that's the Emirates or the Saudis. And I do believe that does create some desire to end the conflict. Now, what the U.S. should be doing is trying to usher that in, and in the meantime, improving the humanitarian situation. I didn't mean to cut you off there, Hassan.
No, I really appreciate everything that's been said today, all the great questions. I really appreciate Kayvon and Demand Progress for hosting us. I'd like to give everybody a final word if they'd like to, offer some parting wisdom here as we look ahead and look at what Congress can do in response to this world's worst humanitarian crisis. Maybe I'll start off in the order of operations here with Shireen, then Elias, then Marcus.
Sure. I think I'll just, emphasize again that we are responsible for this. Multiple people are, but right now, all we can do is control what we do in that region, what we're doing in Yemen. And this is Congress's authority. And so waiting one more day, one more week, it comes at the expense of Yemeni civilian casualties. These are human beings like you and me, people who just want to live their lives, and their lives have been disrupted, if not worse, for the last 6 years. And so we as congressional staffers, as citizens, residents, need to do everything we can to push forward a legal means by which this war ends, our participation in this war ends specifically. And as somebody who was born and raised in Yemen and lived through 2 civil wars, I just want to tell people there's a lot of talks about, if the US stops supporting Saudi Arabia, the war still continues. Yes, the war still continues. This began as a civil conflict. There's still a lot that needs to be ironed out among Yemenis, but they were close to reaching a deal before the Saudis attacked in 2015. And no civil war I've lived through, certainly, or in modern history in Yemen, has lasted this long without foreign intervention. And so foreign intervention is really what's kept this war going this long, and what has caused it to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And we really need to take our own role seriously, not point the fingers at others. We are a belligerent in this war. The United States is a party to this war, and we need to be, in a just world, would be held accountable for this. But the very least we can do is just end our own involvement in this egregious humanitarian condition.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow. I think what I'll say is just about, there was a question earlier about how you sustain, a ground up grassroots approach to this. And I think I've been working on the issue for about 6 years now, since the beginning of the conflict. And I think the one thing that's been so important is encouraging and demanding transparency from our government. Being able to know about what the US is doing, the degree of its support, what it's sending over, has been the catalyst for a lot of what we've seen here. And maybe it isn't about the public having to know exactly what weapon system is going where, but that transparency creates a chain of reactions that can help galvanize that public pressure to ensure that the US security cooperation enterprise is aligned with American values, with the will of the public, and with the best interests of the United States in mind. So I really do think that, especially in the context of getting answers now about what support looks like, we have to be demanding transparency. I think that without that, the rest of it becomes a lot more difficult. And I'll say that transparency on US security cooperation has been an entry point for lawmakers, the American public, into the role that the US has played in a variety of conflicts all over the world. And so I really would just like to put one more plug in for everyone trying to demand that transparency. And with that, I'll turn to Marcus.
Okay, so in terms of, I think I've said most of what I have to say, but in terms of transparency. I do think forcing the issue with a war powers resolution is really critical to bringing the broader public pressure and public attention that it takes to change the equation here, because we've sort of seen this partiality to Saudi Arabia, which does not serve U.S. interests, kind of seeming to reassert itself here, and we have to break that up. And I think shining a light on this is the way to do it.
Thank you so much, Shireen, Elias, Marcus, for all your commentary here. I really appreciate everybody that joined us today for this conversation. Yemen remains the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and there's a lot still that we can do about it. We've got vehicles like the War Powers Resolution, the National Defense Authorization Act, continued public statements, public pressure, and it's all needed. So with that, I think we can close it there. Please feel free to send emails to Kayvon for follow-up questions, and with that, we'll sign off.